Oh, welcome, my child. Sit, come closer. There's nothing quite like listening to the secrets of this ancient world, woven with stories by the light of the fire, is there? Today I will tell you about that magical time that began to take root centuries ago in the misty lands of Britain, a time when swords and kings echoed through the land. Know this, every legend is born from a beginning, and today I will take you to that beginning, the story written in the sword inside the stone, the one that shaped young Arthur's fate. This is the tale of an ordinary boy who rose to the throne and became a beacon of hope for his people. But this journey is neither easy nor ordinary. Arthur's fate isn't just his own path, it's also the path of a nation, Britain, moving from the darkness of chaos toward the light of unity. Now let's take a journey back in time to explore the story of that sacred sword once hidden deep within the stone. Ah, my child, once upon a time, the lands of Britain were a peaceful home under the protective wings of Rome. But no empire's shadow lasts forever. The day came when the Roman legions, focused on protecting their western lands, withdrew from Britain. And just like that, this ancient land was left exposed, like a warrior without its shield. I believe immediately that at any moment France may be in trouble. With Rome's departure, a void was created here. Not just a power vacuum, but also a void of hope. Barbarian tribes coming from the seas and mountain passes began to raid the heart of Britain, spreading fear. Saxons, Jutes, and Angles, all trying to take advantage of the weakness. The local people were lost among fragmented leaders. Small kingdoms were at odds, clans were independent. A leader who could unite them under one banner was nothing more than a dream in the eyes of the people. It was right in the middle of this chaos that a figure slowly began to appear. Merlin. Ah, Merlin. Was he an ordinary man or a wizard with ancient knowledge? Some saw him as a prophet, others as a gift from the gods. But Merlin's prophecies began to spread like whispers of hope among the people. His prophecies spoke of a leader who would unite Britain, a king, but not just any king. One who would rise from the people, but be blessed by the hand of the gods. As Merlin shared his dreams and visions of this leader's future, the land of Britain was filled with great expectation. But who was this savior? Where was he? When would he come? Ah, know this. In such times, the hearts of the people are always more ready than ever to turn legends into reality. But if a legend is to be born, the darkness must first deepen. And it was at that very moment that stories of a sword hidden inside a stone and its chosen master began to spread. Listen, my child. While the lands of Britain struggled with darkness, a child quietly entered the world, carrying the hopes of the future. But knowing the identity of this child would not only bring joy, it would bring great danger as well. Because he wasn't an ordinary boy, his fate had already been written by the sword inside the stone. That's why Merlin made a wise plan to protect this child. Arthur, the son of King Uther Pendragon, was entrusted to Merlin's care as a baby. Uther feared that his enemies would harm him. Merlin, however, knew this child was destined to be king in the future. But revealing his identity could spell disaster for both the child and Britain. That's why Merlin entrusted young Arthur to a knight he trusted, Sir Ector. Ector was a loyal man. He promised Merlin that he would raise Arthur like his own son, alongside his own child, Kay. Arthur grew up in Ector's house as an ordinary peasant boy. He worked the fields, cared for the horses, and lived a simple life. No one knew he was actually the son of a king, or that his destiny was to unite Britain. Not even Arthur himself. Arthur was always a curious child. He would gaze at the sky, lost in deep thoughts, as if searching for something among the stars. Kay, Sir Ector's son, was different. He would act like an older brother, sometimes training Arthur harshly, but Arthur always felt that something was missing. He didn't know who he was or where he came from, Yet his life promised more than that of an ordinary peasant. Merlin, meanwhile, was watching from afar. He observed Arthur grow and mature, seeing him develop in the simplicity of his life. The boy might not have learned the lessons a king should know, but he was learning patience working the fields, humility from his arguments with Kay, and the foundations of leadership in his connections with the people of the town. Because a true leader is forged not on a throne, but among the people. And so years passed. Arthur grew into a strong and brave young man, but he still had no idea of his destiny. Merlin was waiting. The right moment had to come. That moment would be when the sword in the stone would reveal its true master to the world. Now, everything was preparing for the birth of a legend, but no one could have guessed that this ordinary young man would one day become Britain's greatest king. Listen, my child. We're talking about a time in Britain when chaos and darkness ruled. After the death of King Uther, the country was left without a leader, and conflict and unrest broke out at every corner. Loyal knights like Hector tried to protect the people, but their efforts weren't enough. Britain needed the strong hand of a king. The people were on the brink of losing all hope. And then, right at that moment, a miracle happened. One day in the middle of London, a sword appeared, one no one had ever seen before. It was embedded in a huge, smooth stone. Sunlight gleamed off the sword's hilt, highlighting the ancient inscriptions carved into it. People gathered around and they read the words engraved on the stone. Whoever can pull this sword from the stone is the rightful king of Britain. These words spread quickly. In every village, in every home, among every knight, they started to talk about it. Who was the one the prophecy spoke of? Who would pull the sword out? People believed that this sword was a sign sent from the heavens, but no one could move it. From all over Britain, powerful warriors, lords and knights came to London. One by one, each tried to pull the sword from the stone, but they all failed. Was the prophecy true, or was it just a story people had made up in their desperation? Merlin, however, watched silently. He knew who would pull the sword out. And then, one unexpected day, Arthur, still unaware of his identity, was living his ordinary life. At that moment, Sir Ector's son Kay was heading to a knightly tournament. But there had been a mistake. Kay's sword was forgotten. They were already on their way to the tournament. In a panic, Kay turned to Arthur and ordered him to find the sword. Arthur, listening to Kay's words, hurried off. And just as Arthur was leaving to get his horses, he heard another outcry. Running through the city searching for a sword for Kay, Arthur found himself standing in front of the famous stone. People had gathered around the stone, but no one dared to get close. Arthur looked at the sword and without thinking grabbed the hilt. It was an instinctive move from a young man unsure of his own strength. And then a miracle happened right before everyone's eyes. The sword slid out of the stone effortlessly. The crowd instantly fell silent. Then, whispers of astonishment began to rise. Could this young boy, this ordinary-looking person, be the king spoken of in the prophecy? Arthur was uncomfortable under the astonished gazes of the crowd. He had only wanted to find a sword for Kay, but when Kay and Hector saw what had happened, the surprise on their faces was impossible to hide. Sir Hector realized this boy wasn't ordinary. The crowd erupted in excitement. Had the prophecy come true? Was this sword pulled from the stone the beginning of a new era for Britain? Merlin, watching from the shadows, smiled slightly. He knew that the plan he had set in motion years ago was now bearing fruit. But this was just the beginning. Arthur still had a long, hard road ahead. Because being a king doesn't end with pulling a sword from a stone. Now we come to the toughest test of young Arthur's journey to the throne. You must understand that the birth of a king is not always met with a victorious cheer. While some celebrate this new order, others feel that their own interests are threatened. Arthur's ascension to the throne found itself in exactly this kind of turmoil. The news that Arthur had pulled the sword from the stone spread quickly throughout Britain. A wave of hopeful joy rose among the people. At last, the king from the prophecy had been found. However, among the nobility, things weren't quite as celebratory. In their eyes, this young man was nothing more than the son of a common farmer. Did pulling the sword really mean he was a true king? Everyone said it did. In fact, there was an advertisement for the king in this London paper. Britain's most powerful lords did not readily accept the idea of this new king. The one who rules over us must come from noble blood, many of them shouted. Others believed Arthur was an impostor. To them, this was just Merlin's trick. They didn't know who Arthur truly was, and they weren't willing to bow down to someone they didn't understand. But Merlin stood by young Arthur. The wise and cunning wizard assessed the situation calmly. He understood the people's concerns, but he knew that what made a king wasn't just where he was born or the name he carried. Arthur had to prove, in the eyes of both the people and the lords, that he was a true leader. Merlin arranged a gathering to publicly support Arthur. The leading lords, knights, and nobles of Britain were summoned. When they gathered, Merlin brought Arthur to the forefront. It was time to lift the veil on Arthur's true identity. His relationship with Juliana and her family was on the back burner, and Merlin had been waiting for a chance to address it. "Listen," Merlin called, his voice carrying both wisdom and authority. "You are here questioning this young man's leadership, but you must know, Arthur is no common peasant. He is of the bloodline of King Uther Pendragon. He is your king because he is the continuation of your royal lineage." The room went silent. The people questioned the truth of these words. But Merlin further solidified his claim by speaking of the entrusted items Uther had given Arthur before his death, ensuring his future as king. Merlin's wisdom and authority lent weight to his words. Additionally, with Sir Ector's confirmation, Merlin's statement became even more believable. Even after the revelation of Arthur's true lineage, some lords hesitated to accept his leadership. But Merlin emphasized that Arthur should be king, not just because of his bloodline, but because of the courage, justice, and leadership potential he carried. "A king is not measured by a name or blood alone," Merlin said. "A king is one who cares for his people's well-being, stands courageously in the face of adversity, and rules with justice. Arthur has drawn this sword not only with the strength of his arm, but with the strength of his heart." These words began to echo among the people. As the lords saw the support of the people, they began to accept that Arthur should indeed be crowned king. Some were reluctant, others still skeptical, but in the end, Arthur was crowned King of Britain. And so, young Arthur's life, which had begun as that of a peasant, continued as that of a king. But this was only the beginning for him. Like every king who ascends to the throne, a difficult road lay ahead. Merlin turned to Arthur and smiled faintly. "The people have accepted you, young king," he said. "But the real challenge lies in making their love and loyalty lasting." Arthur pondered these words deeply. Britain had finally found a leader, but for this leader to become a true legend, there was still much to be done. "Ah, my dear friend, never forget that the true value of a leader is not measured by merely sitting on a throne, but by the courage and wisdom they show in the face of the challenges that arise before them." Young Arthur, before he could even experience the joy of being accepted as king, was forced to face his first great trial. Some of Britain's lords were still questioning his right to sit on the throne. He did sit on the throne. These lords had ruled their lands for many years, consolidating their power independently of the central authority. In their eyes, Arthur's youth and inexperience were seen as an opportunity. "Why should we bow down to this boy?" they questioned. "Are we not kings of our own regions? We don't need a child ruling over us." And so unrest began to spread across Britain. Some lords openly raised the banner of rebellion, while others wove intrigues in the shadows. From the very first days of Arthur's reign, his kingship was under threat. The rebels began to unite in an effort to weaken Arthur's rule. Many of these lords were dangerous enemies, with strong armies and significant influence over the people. Their leader was Lord Lot of Cornwall. Lot was a powerful lord with a charismatic personality and a strong army. He was skilled at gathering other lords around him. His plan was simple: completely undermine Arthur's authority and solidify his own power. When Arthur learned of these developments, he initially fell into a deep silence. He had only just ascended the throne, and he needed time to earn the people's trust. However, if he allowed the rebellion to spread, it would not only threaten his throne, but also the future of Britain. In these difficult times, the wise Merlin appeared once again by the young king's side. He offered Arthur encouragement and taught him what true leadership meant. "Arthur," Merlin said, "a king exists not to rule over his people, but to protect them. He draws his strength not from his sword, but from his justice. To suppress this rebellion, you'll need not only your sword, but your intellect as well." Arthur reflected deeply on Merlin's words. He set about gathering his armies, but he did so not only to suppress the rebellion, but also to show the people that he was a leader who could promise justice and order. His goal was not to spill blood, but to win the trust of the people. And finally, Arthur's army faced the rebels. This would be a test of Arthur's leadership abilities. On the battlefield, the young king's courage and determination impressed everyone. Arthur was not just a leader giving orders, he fought alongside his soldiers at the front lines. This served as a great morale booster for his men. At the end of the battle, Arthur's forces emerged victorious. However, this victory was not just a military one. Arthur chose to speak with the captured rebel lords. Instead of punishing them harshly, he explained why Britain needed to unite. "If we continue to fight each other, these lands will never find peace," he said. "But if we work together, we can make Britain the strongest kingdom the world has ever seen." Arthur's approach moved many of the rebel lords. They realized that this young king was not only a strong warrior, but also a just leader. Some repented and swore loyalty to Arthur, while others quietly withdrew and never attempted to rebel again. This event marked the first great turning point in Arthur's leadership story. He had proven that he was a king not only by the strength of his sword, but also by the strength of his heart and mind. Thus, Arthur took his first step in solidifying his kingdom. But my friend, remember that this was only the beginning. Uniting Britain was just one of the countless trials a king must face. Moreover, greater victories and even harder trials lay ahead for this young king. Now take a breath, for in the next chapter we will discuss Arthur's journey to becoming a legend. My dear friend, remember that without the guidance of a wise mentor, no leader can truly find their way. One of the greatest blessings in Arthur's story was having someone like Merlin by his side. Merlin was not just a magician, but one of the sharpest minds in history and a deep source of wisdom. His teachings shaped the young king's character, turning him into a leader who not only fought, but also protected and guided his people. During Arthur's rise to the throne, Merlin was always there by his side. The young king learned from Merlin that preserving his throne was not just about physical strength, but also about wisdom and justice. Merlin often said, "A king's greatest weapon is not his sword, but the love of his people." This simple yet profound statement became the cornerstone of Arthur's understanding of leadership. Merlin guided Arthur not only in how to defeat his enemies, but also in how to win the heart of a people. Sometimes he would walk with Arthur through dark forests to help him understand the language of nature. Other times he would tell him of the mistakes and successes of ancient kings, helping him learn lessons from history. As time passed, Arthur's leadership qualities grew stronger. He began to be known among the people as the just king. A sense of justice, one of the most important values Merlin had instilled in him, was at the core of every decision Arthur made. He sought to be fair in all matters, and was unafraid to listen to the needs of not only the lords, but also the common peasants. Merlin also taught Arthur how to speak the language of the people and how to win their love. He emphasized that a king should not live apart from his people, but rather should be among them, understanding their needs. Thus Arthur became not just a king, but also the protector and guide of his people. Another pivotal moment in Arthur's leadership journey came with the establishment of the Round Table. With Merlin's counsel, Arthur realized the importance of forming a strong bond not only with his people, but also with his knights. However, he decided that this bond should be based on equality. This realization laid the groundwork for the concept of the Round Table. Arthur summoned his most trusted knights and gathered them around the table. But this was no ordinary table. The Round Table was a symbol of equality and unity. The circular shape of the table meant that no knight was superior to another. Everyone had the same rights around the table, and Arthur saw himself as part of this community. Merlin explained that the Round Table was not just a physical object, but also an ideal. The table represented the spread of justice, honesty, and sacrifice among the knights. Through this table, Arthur's understanding of leadership took on a tangible form. Arthur gave a powerful speech to the knights gathered around the table. He told them that the unity and strength of Britain depended on their loyalty to one another. At the first meeting, the knights swore an oath on the principles of the Round Table. We will uphold justice, defend the innocent, and remain united for the good of our kingdom. This meeting officially marked the founding of the Knights of the Round Table and became a cornerstone that strengthened Arthur's reign. Now Arthur was not just a king, but also the leader of his knights. Together, they had built a strong alliance to stand against Britain's enemies and protect their people. The establishment of the Round Table was a turning point not only for Arthur's leadership, but also for the future of Britain. The table became a symbol of justice, loyalty, and unity. Arthur's idealistic approach gradually elevated his story to legendary status and became one of the foundations of his tale. My friend, thus another step was taken in Arthur's journey of leadership, but we must not forget that this journey is filled with even more challenges and victories. Arthur and his knights' story would soon usher Britain into a legendary age. Arthur's nightshirt shaded him in. Ah, my dear friend, now I shall tell you the tale of the weapon that completed Arthur's destiny, the legendary Excalibur. This is not just the story of a sword. It is the epic of a king, taking a great step toward his fate. As a young king, while Arthur struggled to solidify his throne, he learned that behind every victory, a greater test awaited him. One day, Merlin took him to a place that no one knew. When they arrived at the edge of a mist-covered, mysterious lake, Arthur paused in awe. The surface of the lake was still and mirrored, perfect in its reflection. Merlin lowered his head in silence and signaled Arthur to wait. "This is no ordinary lake," Merlin said in a low, wise tone. "This is the place where legends are born. There is a power here, Arthur. A gift is offered here, but only to a king who is worthy. One who is destined for the throne." At that moment, a slight ripple appeared on the surface of the water. The lake seemed to part on its own, and from it emerged a woman of such beauty that it touched the soul. The Lady of the Lake. With her graceful and commanding presence, she approached Arthur. In her hands, she held a sword that shone with a divine radiance. The sword seemed as if it had been forged not by human hands, but by the gods themselves. The lady slowly walked across the water and approached Arthur. "This is Excalibur," she said with a melodic voice. "It belongs only to one who is destined for kingship. It is for one who will rule with justice, protect his people, and use it wisely." As Arthur gazed at the enchanting figure, he took the sword into his hands. Excalibur was light in weight physically, but spiritually it bore an indescribable sense of responsibility. The symbols carved into its hilt seemed to tell a story that spanned thousands of years. In that moment, Arthur understood that this was no ordinary weapon. It was a part of a king's destiny. Excalibur was not just a sword that defeated enemies. It symbolized a king's justice, power, and devotion to his people. As the Lady of the Lake handed it to Arthur, she gave him a warning as well. "A sword can bring you victories, Arthur," she said. "But remember, victory is not won with strength alone. It is won with wisdom and justice. Excalibur reaches its true potential only in the right hands. How you wield the sword will determine how you are remembered as a king." Merlin, agreeing with the lady's words, also spoke to Arthur. "This sword will mark you as a king unlike any other. But remember, no matter how powerful the sword, it is the hand that guides it that is more important." The moment Excalibur was bestowed upon Arthur, it sealed his leadership and fate. This sword would become a symbol that would not only make Arthur remembered as a king, but as a legendary leader. From that moment, Excalibur became the sacred bond between Arthur and the destiny of Britain. When Arthur raised the sword high into the sky, a beam of light seemed to shine down upon it, as if even the heavens were celebrating this moment. When he turned to his people, he was no longer just a king. He had become the hope of their future. My dear friend, this is one of the most significant turning points in Arthur's legend. The story of Excalibur is not just the tale of a king, but of a symbol that changed the fate of an entire people. However, remember that every great power comes with great responsibility. Arthur was ready to bear this responsibility, or at least, that is what he believed at the time. My dear friend, every step in the legend of Arthur carries the marks of a king's growth. Yet none is as grand and unforgettable as the building of Camelot. Camelot was not merely a structure of stone and mortar. It was a dream that Arthur offered to his people, a symbol of hope and unity. After ascending to the throne, Arthur faced problems from all corners of Britain. Each tribe and region struggled for their own interests, while Arthur desired to unite these fragmented lands. But for that, he needed a symbol, a heart. This need led to the birth of Camelot. Merlin turned to Arthur and said, "A king rules not only with his sword, but with a vision that inspires his people. Build Camelot, Arthur. Let it be the center of peace and justice. It must not be just a city, but a home that will harbor the dreams of your people." Inspired by these words, Arthur took action. He summoned the best stonemasons, carpenters, and craftsmen to build a city rising in the heart of Britain. Camelot would be both a fortress and a home, with its magnificent walls and soaring towers. Camelot was not just a physical structure, it was a web of ideals. In the center of the city, the Round Table Hall stood tall. Here the knights gathered, discussed the fate of the people, and sought ways to uphold justice. The city became a symbol of peace and unity. People from all corners of Britain began to see Camelot as a source of hope. Peasants, lords, knights, everyone wished to be a part of this enchanting city. Arthur built Camelot not only for his own reign, but for the welfare of his people. Music echoed through its streets, festivals were held in its squares, and events that united the people were organized. Camelot became not just a physical capital, but a reflection of a nation's spirit. My dear friend, one of the most important elements that completed the legend of Camelot was its knights. And among these knights there was no name more unforgettable than Lancelot. Before Lancelot's name began to echo across the lands of Britain, his story was already like a captivating fairy tale. To many, Lancelot was not just a knight, but the embodiment of courage, loyalty, and nobility. When Lancelot first arrived at Camelot, he brought a different aura within those magnificent walls. His stance, his determination, and the light in his eyes immediately made it clear that he was no ordinary man. When Arthur recognized his skills and honor, he offered him a place at the Round Table. Here, a deep friendship blossomed between Arthur and Lancelot. Arthur began to see Lancelot not just as a knight, but as a friend, a brother. Together, they would defend the ideals of Camelot, fighting shoulder to shoulder to preserve unity and justice. However, you must remember that Lancelot's story is not only about victories and friendship. His name would be written in Camelot's fate, heralding both a rise and a fall. But until that time, peace reigned within the walls of Camelot. Lancelot had become a part of the Round Table and stood by Arthur's side. Thus, the legend of Camelot grew ever larger. Ah, my dear friend, this story encompasses not just victories but also trials and betrayals. Yet you must be patient to learn them all. Ah, my dear friend, in every great king's tale there is a turning point, a moment that envelops the heart, bringing forth both a test of power and humanity. In Arthur's legend, this turning point was his encounter with Guinevere. This meeting would change not only Arthur's fate, but also the destiny of all Camelot. According to the story, Arthur and Guinevere first met on a spring morning when flowers bloomed and birds sang their melodies. During a hunting trip, Arthur arrived at the lands of Guinevere's father, Leo de Grance. These lands were renowned for their tranquility and beauty, but the true beauty lay in the enchanting presence of young Guinevere. When Arthur first saw Guinevere, he felt as though time had stopped. Her hair shone like gold in the sunlight, and her eyes were as peaceful as a deep lake. In that moment, Arthur felt a warmth in his heart, a warmth that could not be conquered by a sword, but one that was born from love. Guinevere also noticed Arthur's gaze. His brave stance, elegant yet strong, deeply moved her. However, she did not yet know that a king had taken notice of her. Arthur had formed a friendly relationship with Guinevere's father, Leo de Grance. Through this, he had more opportunities to see Guinevere. What began with shy greetings evolved into deep conversations, laughter, and shared dreams. Arthur felt that every moment spent with Guinevere filled the emptiness within him. Merlin had often given him this piece of advice. A true king is great not only for ruling his people, but for ruling his heart. Guinevere had captured Arthur's heart, and she had done so without any force or struggle. Guinevere too felt safe beside Arthur. His fair and resolute nature soothed her fears, and she admired him deeply. Yet this admiration was not merely for a king's power. It was for the sincerity and goodness within Arthur. Arthur did not keep his love for Guinevere confined to his heart. He wanted to bring her to Camelot, introduce her to his people, and one day make her his queen. However, this decision was not only about love, but also a sign of responsibility. When Guinevere stepped into Camelot, the people were struck by her grace. Her presence added to the grandeur of Camelot, bringing a new dimension to the vision of peace and unity. Guinevere would not only be Arthur's wife, but also the mother of Camelot. She was preparing for her future role as queen by winning the affection of the people. Ah, but my dear friend, every love story is not as smooth as a fairy tale. Though Arthur and Guinevere's love began with great splendor, they would soon have to bear the heavy burden of destiny. But at that time, these two young hearts knew only the love they shared and dreamed that together they would shape the future of Camelot. Thus, my dear friend, the story of Arthur and Guinevere was the beginning of both a love and the birth of a nation. Ah, my dear friend, you must know that in the story of Arthur's reign as a king, there were not only days of peace, but also moments of great trials. The true worth of a leader is revealed not only in times of peace, but when faced with the harsh face of war. Arthur's first great test came in the form of such a battle. The rise of Camelot and Arthur's efforts to unite his people resonated throughout Britain. However, every victory comes at a cost. The growing influence of Camelot had stirred unrest in neighboring kingdoms. Arthur's ideals of justice and unity clashed with the interests of some nobles and kings. One such kingdom lay to the west of Camelot. The ruler of this kingdom saw Camelot's power as a threat. "Arthur can do as he pleases within his lands," this king murmured. "But if he dares to intervene in my borders, I will have no choice but to fight him." Thus, tensions between the two kingdoms began to rise. One day, a raid was launched on one of Camelot's border villages. Innocent people lost their lives. Homes were plundered, and fields were set on fire. This attack was a direct challenge to Arthur's ideals of justice and protection. As a king, Arthur knew he had to defend his people. Merlin, looking at him with deep wisdom, said, "Arthur, this war will not just be a test for your lands, but for your ideals. If you act with justice and manage to unite your people, victory will be yours." Drawing strength from Merlin's guidance, Arthur gathered his army. The knights of Camelot came together at the round table. "In this war, we will not only fight with our swords, but with our hearts," Arthur declared. "We will fight for the safety and honor of our people." The battle began as the two armies faced off in a valley. Arthur stood at the forefront of his army, clad in shining armor and holding Excalibur. He knew that leadership was not only about giving commands, but also about leading with courage and setting an example. The battle was fierce. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but Arthur's forces, aided by his strategic genius and the valor of his knights, gained the upper hand. Arthur proved to be not just a commander but a leader on the battlefield. He gave his people courage, freeing them from fear. In the end, Camelot's army emerged victorious. As the enemy forces retreated, Arthur's name began to echo throughout Britain. He was no longer just the king of Camelot. He was recognized as a leader and protector. After the victory, Arthur stood before his people. "This victory is not just the triumph of our swords, but of our unity and faith," he said. "Camelot will remain a symbol of peace and justice." This victory further strengthened Arthur's influence over his people. The people believed that he was not just a king, but a savior. Under his leadership, Camelot became not only a kingdom, but a beacon of hope. Ah, my dear friend, wars come and go, but the trust and inspiration a king imparts to his people last forever. Arthur's victory in his first great battle solidified the Camelot legend and made him a leader who would be remembered throughout history. Oh, my dear friend, sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom do not come from outside, but from within. And this dark shadow that emerged during the peaceful days of Arthur's reign was none other than Morgana. You would know her as Arthur's half-sister, but this bond made their fates even more complex. Morgana was a woman of captivating beauty and sharp intellect, but within her there was growing unrest. The elevation of Arthur in the kingdom caused Morgana to question her own importance. Once feeling powerful as a part of the royal family, Morgana now felt overshadowed by Arthur's leadership. These feelings began to push her toward a darker path. The turning point in Morgana's life came when she discovered her own magical powers. This power made her feel different from others. But magic, as Merlin would later teach her, was not only a gift, but also a great responsibility. Merlin, recognizing Morgana's abilities, tried to counsel her. "Magic," Merlin said to her one day, "is just a tool. How you use it determines who you are. If magic controls you, in the end, you will only harm yourself." But Morgana ignored Merlin's warnings. Instead of controlling her powers, she dreamed of using them to gain more. Morgana's first schemes began with small conflicts within Camelot. She sowed discord, stirring parts of the population against King Arthur's decisions, and planted seeds of mistrust among the knights. These sinister plots threatened the internal peace of Camelot. When Merlin became aware of these intrigues, he confronted Morgana. "Morgana," Merlin said in a deep voice, "those who flirt with darkness will eventually become its slaves. There is still time to save you." But the anger inside Morgana kept her from listening to Merlin's wisdom. Years passed, my dear friend. As Morgana's power grew, so did the darkness within her. She was no longer content with petty schemes, but had become a threat, aiming to destroy all of Camelot. Arthur's successes and the growing glory of Camelot deepened Morgana's jealousy. This jealousy led her to form alliances with enemies of Camelot. Kingdoms along Camelot's borders, which harbored hostility toward Arthur, began to admire Morgana's dark power. Morgana secretly met with the leaders of these kingdoms, making plans to unite Camelot's enemies. "If you want to bring down Arthur and the justice of Camelot, trust me," she said. Morgana strengthened this alliance not only with her magic but with her sharp intellect. She brought the enemy leaders together and made plans for a great attack on Camelot. Morgana's betrayal, once someone Arthur trusted, posed a devastating threat to Camelot. Faced with this threat, Arthur was deeply disappointed. Morgana's betrayal was not only a threat of war, but also a personal wound. Arthur didn't know how to deal with Morgana's hatred, but Merlin stood by him and gave him courage. "Arthur," Merlin said, "Morgana is not your enemy. The darkness within her is. When you fight her, do not lose the light of justice and your heart." With these words, Arthur gathered strength and prepared to defend Camelot. Morgana's magic was powerful, but Arthur's leadership and the loyalty of his knights were just as formidable. In this battle, Arthur would fight not only with his sword, but with the love of his people. In the end, Arthur and Morgana had their first great confrontation. Arthur, avoiding harming her, focused solely on protecting Camelot. This battle marked the first time Morgana's dark plans were thwarted, but this was not the end of their conflict. Morgana would remain one of Camelot's greatest threats. My friend, the complex relationship between Morgana and Arthur adds both depth and tragedy to the story of Camelot. The tale of family bonds and betrayal is an unforgettable part of the Camelot legend. My dear friend, even the darkest storms eventually calm, giving way to peaceful days. So it was in Arthur's kingdom. After Morgana's betrayal and the attacks from enemy kingdoms, Camelot finally began to see the first rays of peace and prosperity. This period came to be known among the people as the first days of peace, for it was not only a time free from war, but also the beginning of an era in which Arthur's leadership began to bear fruit. When Arthur reached victory, he knew he owed it not just to his sword. The loyalty of his knights, Merlin's wisdom, and the love of his people were the invisible threads that held Camelot together. After the victory, Arthur vowed to make Camelot not just a kingdom, but a home. Arthur had made it his duty to listen to his people. He spoke with the peasants, learning about their needs. At the Round Table, the knights not only made decisions about war strategies, but also about the happiness and justice of the people. This was a revolution in the governance of Camelot, for Arthur believed that power should not be concentrated solely in the hands of a king. In the fields of Camelot, crops grew in abundance and laughter echoed through the marketplace. Traders from beyond the city walls spoke of Camelot not only as a kingdom, but as a symbol of peace. The people were deeply connected to Arthur's leadership. His justice and courage set Camelot apart from all other kingdoms. Arthur had won the love of his people, but this love was not solely based on his victories. He valued each member of his kingdom equally, spreading the spirit of the Round Table throughout all of Camelot. His days spent walking among the people, speaking with them, were a reflection of his humble spirit. As one who held the title of king, he preferred to stand beside his people rather than look down upon them. During this time, Merlin spoke these words to Arthur. "Peace is harder than war, Arthur. But remember, true leadership is shown not only on the battlefield, but in times of peace as well." Arthur took these words to heart and continued to work to make Camelot's prosperity sustainable. The peace he built with his people marked the beginning of Camelot's golden age. And so, my dear friend, here we close yet another chapter of our story. Camelot's glory, through Arthur's wise leadership, took root in the hearts of his people. Peace and justice became the cornerstone of this great kingdom. But remember, no story ends here. The fate of Camelot, like all legends, will be shaped by transformations and conflicts. Arthur's story is not finished yet. Ahead of him lie new challenges, great victories, and inevitable tragedies. For the journey of a leader is always a thorny one. Now let us end this night here. It has been an honor for me to spend this time telling the story by the fire. The next time, we will open another chapter of Arthur and Camelot's tale. Until that day, may you remain in peace and never forget. Every story carries a lesson, but to see it, you must keep your heart open. I wish you dreams filled with stories, my dear friend.